Good afternoon. It's my particular pleasure to welcome you all to what is an important event in any academic institution, the inaugural lecture from a holder of a named professorship. Joining me this morning are Professor Irene Tracy, our Vice-Chancellor, Mauro Mucillo, the Chief Executive of IMI Corporate and Investment Banking, which is part of one of Europe's largest financial institutions, Intesa Sanpaolo, and the recipient of the new professorship, my friend and colleague, Professor Alan Morrison. Welcome also to those here today from Merton College, where Alan has been a fellow since 2000, and to the many friends and colleagues from Said and across the wider university. It is, though, a particularly personal pleasure to be standing here today, dressed in Oxford subfusk, to introduce today's lecture from Alan as the Intesa Sanpaolo Professor of Business, Ethics and Finance. I've known Intesa Sanpaolo for many years, and their support for scholarship and scholarships all over the world, including, of course, here at Oxford, has been exemplary. I would like to pay particular tribute to the unique culture and set of values that underpin this support, and the bank's leadership team who bring this to life. Now, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Mauro Mucillo.
Thank you, Rupert. Dear students, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Let me begin by extending a warm welcome to all the students joining us today as you embark your MBA journey. I wish you a very productive and enriching year ahead of you. It's also my pleasure to introduce Alan Morrison for his inaugural lecture as the Intesa Sanpaolo Professor of Business, Ethics and Finance. At Intesa Sanpaolo, we are really proud of our partnership with the University of Oxford. And we are very proud as well for the new professorship, which marks another important step, a milestone, I would say, in what I believe will become an even stronger and more fruitful collaboration in the years to come. Professor Morrison has been closely involved with the Center for Corporate Reputation for many years, working as a principal investigator alongside the Intesa Sanpaolo Research Fellow, as since the early 2025 we have been delighted to support his ongoing work. This professorship reflects Intesa Sanpaolo commitments to responsible business. Business that fosters growth while remaining sustainable, ethical, and beneficial to the society. Professor Morrison's remarks will touch on why reputation matters, both as a tool which provides status and enable action, but also as an intrinsic part of our identity. For the Intesa Sanpaolo and IMI Corporate Investment Banking Division that have been proudly leading for around 10 years, reputation and strong values lie at the heart of what we are as an organization. They shape our people, guide our actions, and influence the impact we have on the world around us. So, without further ado, I give the floor to Alan Morrison, the Intesa Sanpaolo Professor for Business, Ethics and Finance.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. If you're an MBA student, you're probably looking at this procession of people wearing ridiculous academic dress and wondering why this lecture needed 2 introductions. The reason is that, as well as being a lecture, this is a kind of celebration. And at this university, as you're discovering pretty rapidly, we do things in a weird way. We celebrate by wearing white bow ties and academic robes. And as you'll discover in due course, we also wear them for examinations. I'm in a particularly celebratory mood because, as you've just heard, the celebration this time around is the inaugural lecture of the Intesa Sanpaolo Professor in Business, Ethics and Finance. That is, of me. I usually start lectures to students by just wandering in and saying something provocative and outrageous in order to generate a response. But I'm afraid you're going to have to wait a little while for provocation from me, because anyone's inaugural lecture is an important milestone, and I'm going to preface mine with just a few thank yous. I'm going to start by thanking Intesa Sanpaolo. The University of Oxford has benefited enormously for several years from a very close strategic relationship with Intesa. My chair is the latest in a long line of Intesa commitments to scholarships and teaching at this university, and the university and I therefore have a lot of reasons to be grateful for the vision and the close engagement of Gian-Maria Gross-Pietro, the chairman of Intesa, and Carlo Messina, the chief executive, as well as their respective staffs. And I'm also grateful to Mauro, whom you just seen, Mauro Misillo, who's the CEO of IMI Corporate and Investment Division at Intesa, and who generously introduced this lecture. I'm grateful to Stefano Lecchini, who is Chief of Institutional Affairs and External Communications Officer, to Jacques Moscianesi, Group Head of Institutional Affairs, to Matteo Boagli, who's Head of Institutional Special Projects and Policies, and who manages the day-to-day relationship between Intesa Sanpaolo and the University of Oxford. And it's been a real pleasure to get to know all of these people and more in recent years. So today's lecture is not just special to me, but it's a punctuation mark in a long and continuing relationship. And Rupert Younger, whom you saw earlier at the start of the proceedings, also wearing a white bow tie, has been the central figure in that relationship. Rupert's the founder and the director of the Centre for Corporate Reputation here at the Business School, and he's been my friend and colleague for almost 2 decades. Rupert came here after he'd already had one incredibly successful career in PR, and then he came into academia and created the Centre for Corporate Reputation from scratch and has built it into a globally recognized centre of excellence coupled with institutions and a community of scholars from the United States, Europe, Australia, Asia, and Africa. And the centre has a large network of practitioners from the upper echelons of business, finance, policy, and the NGO sector. So working with Rupert and the centre's communities has literally changed the way that I see the world, and it's significantly changed the nature of my scholarship. So, thank you, Rupert, for everything you've done for Oxford and everything you've done for me. I see some of my business school colleagues here today. I'm really appreciative, and this is a chance for me to thank them for all the time they spend talking to me about ideas and for engaging with the corporate governance of this place. I'm grateful to the postdocs I work with through the Corporate Reputation Centre. It's a little premature of me to thank the MBA students, as I met you for the first time 2 minutes ago, but I can confidently say that I'll be thanking you in 12 months for your passion and engagement, so you can have an advance on those thanks right now on tick. And finally, Merton College has been my Oxford home for the last quarter of a century. Right at the front of the lecture theatre today are 3 wardens of the college. Professor Dame Jessica Rawson occupied that role when I arrived at the college, so I think I have Jessica to thank for my career. She was followed later on by Professor Irene Tracy, who was warden of the college and is now vice-chancellor of this university, which is a big and important role. So it was brave, or maybe foolhardy for her, to leave Merton to take this job up. I'm grateful that she did. Irene was succeeded by Professor Jennifer Payne, who arrived at Merton a year or 2 before I did, and who has been an excellent friend and colleague for all the years I've been in Oxford. So I'm delighted, honoured, and actually, frankly, slightly terrified to have all 3 of you auditing my work today. I'm also very happy that several of my oldest Merton friends have come along today, along with my partner, Han. Okay, let's get down to business. The technology is working, fantastic. One of the nice things about giving a lecture like this type is you get to decide what you're going to talk about. And I've decided that rather than deliver a polished and completed piece of scholarship, I'm going to talk about a work in progress. I'm going to talk about reputation, and I'm going to talk about why it matters so much. Some of you, probably many of you, probably think that reputation is useful because it helps us to get things done. And you're right. But I'm going to argue that it's also an important thing because at a very deep level, it's constitutive of what we are. We need reputations to live well, we need them to build meaningful lives, and those reputations are often constructed in organizations. Of course, there is a massive literature on reputation, or perhaps not of course, trust me, there is a massive literature on reputation. Oxford University Press is about to publish a handbook on reputation and other forms of social evaluations that's co-edited by Rupert. But the existing literature doesn't touch much upon philosophical questions that I'm going to be concerned with today, and it doesn't draw the sorts of ethical conclusions that I'm going to derive. I've just signed a contract to write a book about these things, so today gives me a chance to test drive some of those ideas as I think through them with a captive audience. So, in order to explain the sorts of things I'm concerned with, I'm going to start with a couple of examples. The first example relates to a natural disaster that Haiti experienced 15 years ago. So in January 2010, a magnitude 7 earthquake occurred about 15 miles from the capital Port-au-Prince. It was followed by at least 52 powerful aftershocks, and it was an utter tragedy for Haiti. As you can see from this slide, there was a range of estimates for the death toll, but even at the lower end, at least 85,000 people were killed by this. 1 million people lost their homes. Communication systems, roads, and basic sewage systems stopped working, and inevitably there was an outbreak of cholera. At one stage, bodies were literally being stacked in the streets. So if you were paying attention at this time, and you're in a position to do so, you might have responded to this disaster by writing a check to an aid agency. I gave a small amount of money to MSF, but a lot of people donated to Oxfam, which is a huge and respected charity that was founded in Oxford on Broad Street 83 years ago. And I appear to have done something. Anyhow. Anyway, about 20 months after the earthquake, Oxford's Haitian country director resigned. His name was Roland van Haumeren. Oxfam didn't say why. They did report that some other workers were suspended pending an inquiry, which they said was not concerned with fraud. I presume that people who really know this sector could guess what it was all about, but I didn't, and this story scarcely ruffled my surface. The reason for Van Haumeren's departure was uncovered 6.5 years later when the Times, that's our Times, not the New York Times or the Straits Times or one of the other Timeses, ran a story that claimed that Van Haumeren had been employing prostitutes at his Oxfam villa. So I've talked about this story in the classroom, and a natural response from some students is to argue that there's nothing wrong with prostitution. It's something that liberal society should tolerate and possibly even celebrate as an expression of autonomy. I don't think I even need to address that argument today, because the prostitution we're talking about involved people who were relying upon Oxfam for aid. Some of them were very young. ITV ran a story about a girl who was 17 years old when all of this happened, and who was employed by Van Haumeren as a prostitute when he was 61 years old. And she was relying upon him and other aid agencies for food. So this seems to me to be a horrible and profound abuse of power, and it seems to dehumanize the victims. The condition, in my opinion at least, for a liberal market in sexual services simply didn't exist. And Oxfam clearly didn't want to argue that Van Haumeren and the young women with whom he had sex were engaged in a justifiable and fair trade. They allowed Van Haumeren to leave quietly, and they tried to prevent reports of his activities from reaching the public. Of course, thanks to Sean O'Neill of the Times, they failed. Oxfam was forced to report itself to the Charity Commission, which established an inquiry about the affair, and a year later, the inquiry's report claimed that Oxfam hushed up Van Haumeren's behaviour in order to protect its reputation. And that conclusion runs all the way through all the commentary on this sorry affair. Of course, they failed to protect their reputation, and the consequences for Oxfam of this story emerging were almost terminal. Without government aid, Oxfam would probably have gone to the wall. And hushing up what certainly feels like, to me at least, like the systematic abuse of young women is morally obscene. In suppressing this information and denying those women the apology and the recompense they were certainly due, Oxfam profoundly disrespected them. And the Charity Commission agrees with me. As you can see here, it stated in its report that no charity is so large, nor its mission so important, that it can afford to put its own reputation ahead of the dignity and the well-being of the people it seeks to protect. Okay, that's one story. Because of a concern for reputation, Oxfam did something that any 17-year-old child could tell you was wrong. Here's another story. This one's fascinating to me. I love to teach this one, although now that you've all seen it, I guess I'll have to find a new case study. It concerns the UK's post office. So if you've just arrived here from another country, maybe I should tell you a little bit about the post office. It was founded in 1660. That was 47 years before the Act of Union that combined England and Scotland. It's a very storied institution, and until about 25 years ago, it was trusted and respected pretty much by everyone. It's got about 11,500 branches, actually about 11,650, that are run by franchisees who are known, irrespective of their gender, as sub-postmasters. And at the start of this century, it had its own team of people investigating possible instances of fraud amongst the sub-postmasters, and it had the power to bring private prosecutions against them. And when that happened, the police typically declined to engage with the facts of the case. In 2000, the post office installed a new computer system called Horizon. At the time, it was the largest IT deployment anywhere in Europe. And almost immediately, Horizon started to identify shortfalls in sub-postmasters' accounts. The post office was adamant that the Horizon system was infallible, and it started to prosecute sub-postmasters whose accounts showed a shortfall. The trouble was that, as anyone who's ever used a computer system could probably guess, Horizon was not flawless. It was, in fact, full of bugs when it was deployed. Almost all of the prosecutions that occurred were completely baseless, and the consequences were appalling. Innocent people went to jail. Lots and lots of people were bankrupted. The post office pursued people for damages in order to encourage the others. Some people lost their mental health, others lost their personal reputations. At least 4 people took their own lives as a consequence of the effects that these horrible, baseless accusations had upon them. And you might imagine that the post office's board would want to prevent this sort of miscarriage of justice. If they had, I wouldn't have projected this slide. The post office did everything it could to suppress relevant information. Lawyers tell me that what they did was almost certainly illegal, so maybe, God willing, there'll be some prosecutions soon. They lied to postmasters about the scale of the problem. Each of them was told, you're the only one. There were thousands. They even destroyed evidence. None of that became apparent until, first of all, a High Court case that forced disclosure, and second, a public inquiry, which concluded earlier this year, and which we'll be reporting in November, this November. The scale of the post office's heartless duplicity is almost too huge, in my view, to contemplate, and yet it existed. Paula Venables, whom you see on this slide, was the post office's chief executive from 2012 to 2019. Here she is speaking to the Business Select Committee of the UK Parliament in 2015. She certainly knew at this time, we know this from the High Court case and from the public inquiry, she had known for 2 years that the post office's prosecutions were unsafe. And yet she didn't tell that to the Select Committee. Instead, she said, I'm not denying at all there were problems. Of course there were problems. There are problems in any organisation. But this is about the reputation of the post office. I want us to pause for a while to consider the monumentally, ethically appalling nature of this sentence. The post office's reputation is an abstract and complicated social construct. And MPs were being asked to accept that this construct was so important that several hundred probably unjust prosecutions should be left unexamined in order to protect it. But let's employ the principle of charity and imagine that Paula Venables had some sort of idea that explained, some sort of notion that explained what she was doing. Let's deploy the principle of charity. After all, Paula Venables is an ordained minister of the Church of England. She's actually preached at my college, a fact of which we're proud. What could possibly justify her aggressive attempt to protect the post office's reputation? Spoiler alert, the answer is going to be nothing. In order to get to grips with corporate reputation and its moral relevance, I'm going to go back to first principle and ask a few basic questions. First of all, I'm going to try to be really precise about what a reputation is. It's one of those terms that we use all the time, and sometimes it's not clear what we mean. So I'm going to try and explain what I mean. Then I'm going to talk about the sorts of things that have to be true of a corporation or some other organizational entity if it's going to possess a reputation at all. In other words, if you're a philosophical wonk, I'm going to talk briefly about the ontology of reputation. Then I'm going to ask how reputations in general and corporate reputations in particular relate to what is good in a human life. And I think I'm going to claim that you can't have a meaningful human life without reputation, and reputation is going to be really very constitutive of what you are. And if I have time, I'm very briefly going to talk about two things. Firstly, circumstances in which people attempt to manage their reputations. It's hard to manage a reputation because it exists in other people's heads, but they try. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what artificial intelligence has to do with reputation. My expectation is I'll get about 5 minutes in on the AI question, but it raises interesting thoughts, which I'd like to share with you. So I'm going to do a conceptual analysis of a natural language term, and the natural place to start is the dictionary. So here's what the Oxford English Dictionary has to say about reputation. It's pretty cool. People were talking about reputations in 1390. In 1549, Erasmus was claiming that the loss of reputation does you only much harm as you feel, which seems to me circular and pointless. The loss of my leg would do me only as much harm as I feel, and I think I would feel it quite a lot. Anyway, the OED presents a bunch of definitions which appear on the left-hand side of this slide. Some of them are now obsolete. To save you the effort of squinting at the slide, I've summarized the most common usages for you. First of all, reputation is often associated with esteem. That seems clear. I can say that someone has a good reputation, and I probably mean that they're good at something that I care about, even if that just means they're good in social situations. I can also say that they have a reputation for being abrupt and stupid. In other words, reputation could be is usually a statement about character or about related qualities, but it doesn't have to be a mark of esteem. And third, under some circumstances, rather than talk about your character, I might claim that you have a reputation for a particular characteristic, for being a particular type of thing. So maybe you have a reputation for being a fast cyclist, for example. I'm going to use some example locutions from the OED to try and get a slightly better handle on the way that those meanings arise in practice, and that will leave us in a place where I can tell you what I think a reputation really is. So the first point is that reputational statements often refer to a generally accepted fact about a person and their characteristics. So here we have someone with a reputation for getting through his work thoroughly. Reputational statements often carry some affective burden. In other words, when we say something about someone's reputation, we often express some sort of emotion. So here's Sherlock Holmes referring to the sinister and murderous reputation of Killer Evans. And critically, while we can try to influence them, we don't get to decide what our reputations are because they're held by groups of people who assess us for themselves. So here's a remark about a surgeon whose reputation is maintained in the medical world, that is, by other surgeons. So in light of the behaviour of Oxfam and the Post Office, it ought to be obvious that people care about their reputations. One reason, as you can see from this 1989 sentence, is that people like to be appraised by others in a positively affected way. You might be proud of your reputation as a good worker, for example. If you'd only ever encountered reputation through the economic literature on the topic, then the main reason people like to have a reputation might, in your opinion, be that a good reputation allows them to do useful stuff, like sell products or convince you that what they're doing is, admirable or something like that. That's certainly one reason why reputation matters. The New York Times magazine stated in 1987, and is quoted by the OED, that reputation is a sort of valuable, if hard to value, asset. But that's clearly only part of the story. Someone who's proud of their reputation as a good worker isn't just pleased that their reputation will get them a job. They're also pleased because they think this reputation says something important about what they are, and they're proud of that. So reputation isn't just a straightforward appraisal, it affects the way that we experience the world. Here's Samuel Johnson, 26 years before the publication of The Wealth of Nations, remarking that his reputation as an author condemned him to a type of misery. I presume he was upset because his reputation required him to behave in a certain way. Perhaps he was just trying to be witty, but in any event, I'm going to return to this type of reputation effect at some length in a little while. Okay. Now I've thought for a little while about the way that people talk about reputation, I'm going to try a slightly more precise characterization of the word. I'm going to refer to the sorts of things that have reputations as assessed actors. People are assessed actors. I think the history of the Post Office and Oxfam probably indicates that other things can be assessed actors too. And as an actor moves through the world, it leaves a trail of actions and consequences in its wake. I'm going to call that its vapor trail. Every single one of you has a vapor trail. If I ask about you, your friends will tell me what you did, what your accomplishments are, what you did last Saturday that's a bit embarrassing. Those things are all in your vapor trail. And you can't get away from it. You have a vapor trail. And at least until social media came along, your vapor trail didn't last forever. Stuff you did 10 years ago that was embarrassing will be forgotten. Now, unfortunately, it's probably out there forever. Or maybe fortunately, but I think unfortunately. When we encounter another person, we encounter their vapor trail. And it's a fact about human persons that we believe their vapor trails teach us something about them. If I see you being persistently kind to other people, then I'll conclude that you're the sort of person who is kind. That works for cruelty, stupidity, and for physical strength. I'm going to call that sort of conclusion a type claim. A type claim is just a statement about an assessed actor that makes a claim about their current and their future propensities. So if my friend Joe drinks too much wine every time we meet, I might make the type claim you see here, that Joe drinks more than doctors recommend. And when I make a type claim, it might be positive or negative. In other words, it could be evaluative. And I'm going to think of the most important claims as being type claims that have an evaluation attached to them. So I'm going to use the word assessment to refer to an evaluative type claim that's derived from someone's vapor trail. So I look at what you do and I say that guy's awful because he drinks too much, or that guy's hysterical because he drinks too much. These are two different assessments, possibly from the same vapor trail. But we still haven't quite established what a reputation is, because reputations are maintained in groups. That was obvious from the dictionary extracts that I showed you earlier, and it seems intuitively obvious to me at least that the reason we need a separate word for reputations is that they say something about collective as opposed to individual assessments. So my definition of a reputation rips off an idea from the linguistics literature. I'm going to define a reputational proposition to be an assessment that forms part of the common ground of a group of people whom I'm going to refer to as a reputational audience. So something's part of our common ground if we all accept it as a basis for reasoning. So we all get together, we talk about Bob, and we all think that Bob is untrustworthy, and we just accept that as something that we're all going to accept as something that we can reason from. So I think I behave like it's true, you behave like it's true, I know that you behave like it's true, and you know that I behave like it's true, I know that you know that I know it behaves like it's true. It's common knowledge. And I could accept in theory, I could accept a proposition as being true in one audience and not accept it as being true in another. I can reason in two different ways in two different contexts. People do that, but it's quite tiring, I think, to maintain that sort of contradictory stance for quite a long time. Okay, that was the technical bit. And that's enough formality for a little while. If you're interested in reputation, you probably know Taylor Swift has a studio album called Reputation. The artwork is awesome. I think it's kind of interesting to try and understand Taylor Swift's reputation. I'm hardly an expert, but I've done some work. Everything about Taylor Swift, from her music to her politics, is mediocre and predictable. She isn't, it's not my view, she isn't a thoughts leader or an artistic genius. She's a depressed girl boss, cat lady, whose narcissism has made her a toxic romantic partner. To Democrats and their corporate media allies, however, she's an invaluable asset in their political arsenal. Those are not my words. Those are the words of someone called Evita Duffy Alfonso, who published them in The Federalist. Apparently, Ms. Duffy Alfonso represents a swathe of anti-Taylor opinion on the right of American politics. The simple existence of that swathe of opinion, of Taylor Swift derangement syndrome, is a kind of fascinating social phenomenon to me, but I haven't got very much time, so I'm not going to pursue it here. Here's another assessment of Taylor. Taylor Swift isn't just a name or a global icon. She's a force of pure positivity, an exemplary role model for countless young women out there. Her empathy, talent, and grace shine, even being beaten down by an extremely harsh industry. In a world that often questions the intentions behind every action, it's refreshing to see the genuine good that Taylor Swift embodies. That one comes from Olivia Johnson, who moderates a Facebook group called Taylor Swift's Vault. Casual empiricism, by which I mean just looking at the world around me, convinces me that Ms. Johnson's views are shared by quite a lot of people. And I think we're getting at something that's actually quite relevant and important here. There's no reason to believe that the reputational propositions accepted by one reputational audience are shared by another. A reputation is assigned to an actor by a particular audience for a given thing. And it's assigned to the actor. The actor doesn't get to choose it. Clearly, Taylor Swift didn't choose the first of those reputations. And when we say that someone has a good or a bad reputation, we're kind of assessing all of the reputational statements. You know, she's a mad cat lady, she's narcissistic, or she's a force for good and she's talented. We assess all of those things and we just apply a valence to them. So readers, The Federalist apparently assigned Taylor a bad reputation. Those of Taylor Swift's Vault assign her a good one. So I don't think we can think about reputation without thinking about the audience that maintains it. And I think that we can better understand a reputation if we think about the ways that an audience processes it. The key observation, I think, is that reputational propositions are really convenient. I've got a limited amount of bandwidth, and so have you. Accepting a reputational proposition without thinking it through for myself means I can save my processing power for other important tasks. So, for example, if everyone I know accepts that what scientists say about vaccinations is unreliable because they're in the pay of Big Pharma, then it's easy and convenient for me to accept that statement, objectively foolish as it is, as a basis for my reasoning about vaccinations, especially when I do so with other members of that group. It goes further than that, I think. Actually, if my peer group behaves as if that's a fact, I might accept those reputational propositions in order to honour group norms, essentially to fit in and not to feel too uncomfortable and not to have people hate me. How I understand the world, in other words, is partly determined by reputational propositions. It's also the case that how I understand the world is partly determined by what I pay attention to. People who pay special attention to gender understand the world in inherently gendered ways. People who are obsessed with social background see the world in class-oriented ways. People who pay attention to the risks but not the rewards of vaccinations see the world possibly in anti-vax ways, and so on. So the way that attention is directed is very important. All sorts of things determine what we pay attention to. One is what we believe about the world. A person who thinks that vaccinations cause autism probably pays special attention to situations in which a child who had a vaccination is later identified as autistic, and not to the totality of the evidence. And in a particular group setting, I might accept the group's reputational propositions as true, and that means, like the rest of the group, I pay special attention to information that reinforces reputational propositions. In other words, reputation directs attention. It affects how we see the world and what we care about. Something similar applies to our emotional response to events. If one person experiences a shooting as a tragedy and another experiences it as vindication, then they probably have different affective attitudes towards guns or towards the victim of the shooting. And again, those affective attitudes in group settings are determined by the valence of the reputational propositions that we accept within the group. If everyone I know has a particular view about the shooting of a particular person, Charlie Kirk, say, it seems kind of likely that I will simply go along with that because it's a convenient way to reason. I'll certainly have to think in terms of the way they think, even if what I'm doing is responding to it. I'm not going to pursue this thought today, but I think it's likely that some sort of reputational doom loop might be one of the reasons that our politics is currently so polarised. All of this makes it really hard to revise a reputation. If a group accepts a reputational proposition, it doesn't expend a lot of energy justifying it, and when it does pay attention to the world, it finds evidence, because its attention is directed in that way, it finds evidence that supports the propositions, and it sanctions people who concentrate on other things. It feels good about things that reinforce the reputation and hostile towards things that don't. So spotting evidence that contradicts a reputation and then using that evidence to revise the reputation is difficult. Okay, so now we've talked about what reputation is, we've talked about the people who maintain a reputation, and I've started to argue that reputation maybe affects the way that you see and experience the world. So we're getting to the point where it's probably worth expanding on these things and talking about why reputation matters. And I'm going to come up with two essential arguments. The first one, the traditional answer, at least to economists and people like that, is that reputation is a type of asset that allows you to get stuff done. The second answer, which is the one I'm going to try and concentrate on a bit more today, is that reputation affects our understanding of what we are. So, one useful way to think about reputations is they're useful because they allow people to make commitments that they otherwise wouldn't be able to make. So, a lot of the time I can make commitments by writing a contract, and then you will sue me if I violate the terms of the contract. But some things are just too complicated or too hard to write down to contract on. But if I always behave in a certain way, you don't need me to contract. You can rely upon the reputation that I have to ensure that I behave in a particular way. And you can see this all over the place. One very famous example, because it's easy to watch, is the way the Hasidic community trades diamonds in New York. They never write a contract, they just trust each other, and they rely upon their reputations to get things done. It means they can get things done very cheaply. But that means assets, if you start thinking too hard like this, and this is a good way to think, I've written articles that think of reputation in this way, but if you start thinking of reputation only in this way, you start thinking of it as a kind of asset. And if it's an asset, then you should protect it for as long as it's useful and for no longer. And thinking like that is what caused the scandals at the post office and Oxfam. In other words, thinking of reputation only as an asset ignores something that's important and something that was outrageous about those actions. Those things were outrageous because of the profound effect they had on people who worked with two organizations. When Paula Venel says this is about the reputation of the post office, she's thinking of the reputation as being an asset, and she's absolutely missing the point that 900 people were improperly persecuted, 160 went to jail, and 4 of them took their own lives. Okay, here's another way to think about reputation. I'm going to think about reputation as being tied up in something about what we are. And in order to explain the sorts of things I have in mind, I'm going to talk about a TV drama called The Tourist. Some of you might have seen it. Some of you might recognize this guy from a different drama, which we won't discuss today. The Tourist follows the adventures of an Irishman who wakes up in the Australian outback with complete amnesia. And this is disturbing, as you can imagine. He doesn't know his name, but he doesn't know what sort of person he is either. He's really desperate to find out. We need to know what sort of person we are. I think that's a statement about what people are. And in time, he discovers that he is Elliot Stanley, that he's an accountant to drug dealers, and that he's on the run from a criminal from whom he has stolen an enormous amount of money. And learning this is fascinating in the drama, to me at least, because Elliot's really distressed. He suddenly believes himself to be a bad person. And because he's a bad person, he sees the world in particular ways and approaches the future in a particular way. Even if he wants to be something else, he has to deal with the fact that he is at present objectively bad. It's a pretty good TV show, but it generated thoughts. In fact, it blew my mind in ways that the scriptwriters probably didn't intend. Suppose he hadn't recovered his memory. Perhaps he'd have spent the rest of his life working in a homeless shelter. In other words, perhaps he'd have been good. And of course, if that possibility existed for the amnesiac Elliot, it surely exists for the Elliot who's just discovered himself to have been a bad person in the past. But the bad Elliot doesn't pursue this route. He doesn't think it's what he is. And that raises all sorts of difficult, fascinating questions, most of which I can't talk about today, but let's talk about some of them. I'm talking here about Elliot's self, his sense of what he is. I'm going to use that term in a fairly technical sense to refer to a person's sense of who and what they are in the world. So it's a reasonably enduring statement about what a person is. So I'm pretty sure that myself is a thing that enjoys walking in the Cotswolds with a dog. It's also someone that loves drinking wine with friends and arguing with them. And it's someone that really hates it when they fall out irredeemably over politics. I've got a fairly strong sense that these statements are quite enduring statements about what I am. And I also believe that they needn't be true of me. I wasn't born like this. Like Elliot's, myself is up for grabs. So if I want to understand myself, I need a theory of how it gets constructed. And like Elliot, I think I get there by interpreting my actions. I know that I've been dog walking and I'm drinking wine for years. I know these are constitutive aspects of me. Of course, there's something circular here. Once I come to think of myself as dog walking, wine drinking, and argumentative, I'd actually fill my time walking the dog, drinking wine, and arguing. Myself, which is up for grabs, becomes a sort of habit. If I'd done something different all these years, then I would have a different sort of self-sense. More to the point, I could break the habit of myself. I could do that by picking different actions so I interpret myself in a different way. And I think that's really important. I think that's one of the things that makes us human. The dog I like walking with will never stop, ask herself if she's good at being a dog, or if she's doing the right things, or if she should be a different sort of dog and start authoring herself in a different way. You and I get to decide what we are. We get to author ourselves. And I think that's really important. If I don't author myself and I don't experience myself as a thing I have control over, I don't think I'm experiencing my humanity in the fullest possible sense. And if I don't do this properly, or if I do this badly, I think I've failed morally. Human beings, human persons, are things that care about what they are and that work to become better versions of themselves. And that's true of all of you. You're here this year because you care about what you are. You'll be a different version of you in a year's time, and I hope it will be a better version, or at least one that you feel better about. So, now I've told you all that, I need to find something different to say in the first hour of my Trinity term elective. So if human persons are things that experience then author themselves, I guess you should try to understand precisely how they do those things. And the first thing to notice is you construct yourself in entirely social situations. The things I do only make sense in social situations. I can't be a professor without a university and without students. And it seems that people need other people to make sense of what they do and to validate their actions. If I attempted to construct the self of a world-class singer, I would fail because other people need to see me in those terms, and they never will. So my self is created when I look at the vapor trail of my past doings and decide what it means. And I need other people if I'm to create a meaningful vapor trail, and I rely upon the views of others when I determine what the vapor trail means. I think the latter point is so important that we should stop and look at it a little more carefully, because I think it says something quite important about reputations. If I am confident, as a member of your reputational audience, that I can use your vapor trail to determine your reputation. In other words, I look at you, I look at what you've done and what you've done in the world, I make some conclusions about what you are, I attach a valence to them, I go around saying, Sandy is a party animal, or Joe works really hard, or, you know, Simon doesn't work very hard, or etc. If I think I can do that about you, I should believe that you can do it about me. In fact, you're free of the biases and self-justifying statements and motivated reasoning that I bring to bear on myself. I think it's perfectly possible that you are better at interpreting my vapor trail than I am. I'm obviously paying more attention to it than you are, but if you felt like it, I reckon you could figure out what I am and maybe do it more accurately than I can. And once I understand this, I cannot help but account for the views of reputational audiences when I try to interpret my actions in order to construct a self. In other words, I think I understand myself partly in terms of my reputation. A reputation, therefore, is more than just a useful asset. It's also partly constitutive of what I am, and they affect the ways in which I experience the world. And suddenly, we understand Othello, which is partly a play about reputation. In the second act, Cassio is fired by Othello and says, "Reputation, reputation, oh, how I've lost my reputation. I have lost the immortal part of myself, and what remains is bestial." Cassio isn't upset because he's lost a useful social asset. He's commentating not just about the loss of his job or his social position. I think he's lamenting the loss of his sense of self, and that drives him to do all sorts of stuff. And now you can see why I think reputation has an incredibly important moral status. Reputation and selfhood are very tightly braided. Your reputation affects how you experience yourself, whether you want to or not. It alters the things that you think you naturally do, and it affects the things that you can do, and that means it has to undergird self-authorship. So, I want to return to the corporate arena, but before I do, I'm going to take a slight technical detour in order to talk about the ontology of reputation. So there must be a couple of hundred people in the room who are wondering what I mean when I say ontology. Ontology is just a fancy word that refers to the way that things exist in the world. I've argued that human beings are ontologically things that experience their selfhood and that are concerned with its construction. I'd like to spend a few minutes asking how reputation exists in the world. Of course, reputation exists in human consciousness. That's a fun and complicated fact, but it's not the one I want to concentrate on now. I'm interested in what sorts of things can possess a reputation. And if something can possess a reputation, I'm going to say it's reputationally competent. And I think there are three requirements to that. The first, in order to create a vapor trail, you have to be able to act. Only actors can have reputations. That seems obvious, but I'm going to derive a conclusion that some people don't like in 5 seconds from that fact. The second is that reputation attaches to things that can make that we can have long-lived type statements about. That means it must be possible to tell meaningful stories about the actor. I look at what the actor did in the past, and I can deduce things about what the actor will do in the future. They're narratable. And lastly, it must be possible for me to approve and disapprove of the things that the actor does, because reputations have moral valence. And that means there have to be things about the actor that aren't inevitable, because I can't really judge a volcano for exploding. That's just what volcanoes do. I can, however, judge you for pulling out a gun or for being unfunny in conversation. Those things are not optional. So I've been talking about the reputations of people. That seems okay, but even that has some implications for the social sciences. If we can make type claims about a person's probity, for example, then that person can't be a kind of crude utility maximizer, the sort that populates the economic models that I spent the first 15 years of my career writing. And if people are narratable, they probably have to have some character traits, and that turns out to be a surprisingly contentious claim in the psychology literature. But I do not think it makes sense to talk about the reputation of England, say. England cannot act, and that means it's not an agent, and that means, on my account, statements about country reputation are actually statements about something else. They're either statements about something else inside the country, or they're statements about the country that are not reputational statements. And the same, similarly, in my setup, I think it makes no sense to talk about the reputation of a gender, an ethnicity, or of any other category. That one makes for a fun argument, especially if wine's involved, but I don't have time to expand upon it today. It takes quite a bit of work to investigate the reputational competence of a corporate actor, of an organisation. And I don't have time to do it today. My TLDR is that I think corporate actors are reputationally competent. That is, I think they can act, I think they're narratable, and I think we can judge them. And I'll remark in passing for the philosophical wonks in the room that I believe that to be a weaker claim than the claim that corporations are actually morally responsible agents. And I think corporate reputations are important once we've established they exist. They're important because they affect the self-authorship of people. I want to claim that that's the source of their moral relevance. The argument goes something like this. First of all, corporations need their reputations to get things done because they can't use contracts to make all the commitments they need to make. Second, I need corporations to get things done if I'm to do the things that constitute my self-authorship. For example, writing and delivering this lecture is one of the ways I construct myself. Whether you like it or not, attending it is having a small effect on yourself. I used a pencil to write the first draft, and I couldn't have done that without a maze of reputationally supported corporate agreements that enable the production of a pencil. That statement's so deep, there's a book about it. Literally, about how pencils get made. More profoundly, people need corporate actors to take some of the actions that define them. I need the University of Oxford, which is a massive and complicated corporate actor, if I am to be me. If I wanted to author a self that was bound up with the provision of social housing, then I'd need to join a corporate actor with an appropriate reputation, and so on. I think it goes even deeper than that. I think corporate reputations affect the way that we understand ourselves. Remember that people understand our activities by examining their vapor trails and interpreting them. And I think that interpretation is bound up in the reputations of the institutions they work in and through. I think the way that a sub-postmaster experienced their self changed as a result of the Horizon IT scandal. The sub-postmaster may not have changed in any biological sense at all while the scandal was playing out, but the way they understood their actions surely did. And so the post office's misguided attempt to control its reputation served to undermine the capacity of its sub-postmasters to engage in self-authorship, which is the most fundamental human activity. And that is a serious moral failing. I want to say that again because I've just made a big claim. I've argued that my reputation, I've already argued for most of today, that my reputation affects my sense of self. Now I'm claiming that for some appropriate we's, our reputation affects my experience of self. And I can imagine how this might play out for me. I think that one of the things I do, one of the things that's constitutive of myself, is that I teach MBA students how to think about living well when they're doing business. I teach them, I go to the pub with them, I have coffee with them. It's one of the things I do. That's important to how I understand what I am. If the business school's reputation were to plummet for some reason, I might suddenly revise my opinion of my doings and conclude I'm not teaching people how to live well. I'm part of a machine that teaches them how to be rapacious. And then I'd learn that I'm not what I thought I was. And that seems to me very important. Okay, I've already told you about Oxfam and the post office. In the time I've got left, I want to outline a slightly more nuanced case of reputational wrongdoing, at least morally charged reputational activity, and then explain how the framework I've given you might help us to think about the ethics of reputation and influence. And I want to talk about the decision that the private bank Coutts made to debank Nigel Farage. Some of you have only just arrived in this country and don't know who Nigel Farage is. Okay, none of you know that. In case you're one of the very few who don't know who he is, he's a highly influential nationalist politician in this country. He's the leader of the Reform Party, which started out as a very small political party, but I think there's now a serious chance that he might one day be our Prime Minister, so he matters. He's on the left of this picture. In the centre of the picture is Alison Rose, who is the chief executive of NatWest, which owns Coutts, and on the right is Howard Davis, who was chairman of NatWest when the case I'm going to discuss unfolded, who is an alumnus of my college, and concerning whom I have nothing to say. And the story begins on the 29th of June 2023, when Nigel Farage posted a message on X in which he claimed the establishment was closing ranks against him by closing his bank account because it found his political views unacceptable. On the 4th of July, and I must say, I read that and thought, nah. On the 4th of July, the BBC reinforced my prejudices by saying the account was closed because he just paid off a mortgage and fallen below the minimum £1 million borrowing that Coutts requires of clients who don't have a massive current bank account. The source of that story was Alison Rose, the chief executive of NatWest, who was sitting next to the television reporter at dinner the night before. She was the only source for the story. And it turns out it wasn't the full story, at least. On the 10th of July, Nigel Farage used a Freedom of Information request and acquired a 40-page dossier that Coutts had created about him. You can download the dossier from the internet if you're interested. I downloaded it for you. Ironically, in light of what transpired, Coutts had decided to debank Mr. Farage because they thought his association with the bank might harm its reputation. As you can see here, the bank described him as xenophobic and racist and as a disingenuous grifter. The chief executive, in other words, remarkably, he was right. They debanked him because they didn't approve of him. And I was wrong to go, meh. So this was quite a shocking observation. And it was fatal for the chief executive of both Coutts and NatWest. They both had to go. Both institutions took serious reputational hits. Only earlier this year was the action that Farage took against the bank finally settled when they paid him undisclosed levels of damages. And I think the reputational hits the institutions took probably affected the self-authorship projects, their staffs. It's obvious, at least to me, that Coutts was playing with Nigel Farage's reputation, and hence with his projects of self-construction. There are a million reasons why it should have been obvious a priori that debanking Nigel Farage was at least likely to be contentious. And if there's a moral argument against the debanking, I think it has something to do with the way it interferes with his selfhood and his self-authorship, and because of the reputational hits they took with the self-authorship of Coutts' other clients. In the time remaining to me, I'm very briefly going to say something about the ethics of influence and of reputation management. So I'm going to use the term corporate reputation management to refer to a corporate actor's attempt to engage with its reputational audiences. It's not a perfect term because you don't get to pick your reputation, it's maintained by other people, but it's a common term and I haven't found a great alternative yet, although I've experimented with a few. If you want to change an organization's reputation, you have to change the reputational propositions that its reputational audience accepts. And those propositions are found by examining the organization's vapor trail. So you've got three options. First of all, you can just try to change the vapor trail by changing your behavior. That may not be enough on its own because the reputational audience might not notice because of the way its attention is directed, or it might be unwilling to interpret a change of behavior charitably. It might just say greenwashing. So second, you could try to attempt to draw attention to underappreciated elements of the vapor trail. Those could be the consequences of changed actions or merely of actions that haven't been paid attention to. At the same time, you might try to suppress information about parts of the vapor trail that do not comport with your desired reputation. The latter approach is the one the post office took, and I hope it's obvious why it's not a good idea. And third, you could try to change the narrative that's used to interpret the vapor trail. You might need to explain that your new strategy is an attempt to reduce emissions and not merely to hoodwink environmental ratings firms, for example. I'm concerned with the ways in which reputation is bound up in the fundamental human activities of experiencing and authoring selves, and I can see reputation management in terms of those activities. Here are a couple of desiderata. First, given that my experience of self is bound up in the organizations with which I engage, I think corporate reputation management should not lead people to misinterpret what they are. I can't possibly construct a meaningful self if the foundations on which I'm building are illusory. So reputation shouldn't mislead people about things they have a valid claim to know. And reputations, when they can, should enable self-authorship. I'm going to relate those two rules to two forms of reputation management. One of them relates to a way that a vapor trail looks as it spreads out behind us. The other one looks forward to the future date and a future vapor trail. This is a big topic that I'm still thinking through, so I'm going to be reasonably brief. I'm going to talk about backward-facing reputation management, as reputation management occurs when we look back at our vapor trail and we try to decide how we can change the way that people interpret it. The only form of reputation management agent can do in that case is to alter perceptions. And we've seen two examples already of organizations, the Post Office and Oxfam, that engaged in backward-facing reputation management. I think we can identify two reasons that people might do this. The first is a kind of greater good justification. I think Oxfam were doing that. I've got a few former students running charities who've run up against this in their professional lives. They kind of say, well, they don't, some of their peers say, because the good work this organization does, or it's the fact that its capacity for good work relies upon its reputation, we should suppress information that might harm the reputation. The second is a self-protection justification, which acknowledges the importance of positive corporate reputation for an individual sense of self, and so argues that you can manipulate or suppress information in order to protect that sense. And I think self-protection was a big thing at the post office. Most of the people involved, most of the investigators, most of the board, most of the executives were lifetime employees who were very bound up in the post office. Organizations that appeal to a greater good or self-protection as a justification for suppressing information are being stupid, because that sort of cover-up almost inevitably gets discovered and its reputational consequences are terrible. And more importantly, I think they're being immoral because they're doing violence to people's sense of self. I've already claimed that we often see ourselves as others see us. Oxfam's decision to sweep Roland van Houwen's actions under the carpet had expressive power for the teenage girls that he abused. Oxfam was saying that those girls weren't really all that important, and they should be pushed under the bus so that Oxfam continues to do its good work elsewhere. They were saying that abuse didn't matter much, and they were very young, and maybe it would have been easier for them to adopt that interpretation of their vapor trails. And if they did, I think their self-authorship project would have run into the weeds before it really got going. That's a profound moral failure. It's an utter failure to show people the respect that they're due. More generally, suppressing vital information about a reputation in order that it can sustain an inaccurate reputation gives the people working for that organization a false impression of what they are, and that undermines their capacity again for self-authorship. There are some arguments about backward-facing reputation that are probably okay. I think three things work. First, it's clearly right that a company attempt to correct false impressions of its vapor trail. Second, if you're covering up private information that no one's got a right to, that's most likely okay. In this country, homosexuality was decriminalised only in 1967. In Scotland, 1980. In Northern Ireland, 1982. A firm that refused to reveal information about its employees' sexual orientation at that time was surely enabling and not restricting self-authorship. So I can think of situations in which some information can be suppressed, but that wasn't the case at Oxfam or the Post Office. And third, sometimes companies can perform narrative work that helps reputational audiences to understand the importance of overlooked parts of their vapor trail. I'm also concerned with ways that people think about what their reputation will look like in the future. In other words, they think today about actions they'll take now that will affect a vapor trail that emerges a year or 2 years down the line. And I'm going to call that forward-facing reputation. Any form of forward-facing reputation runs the risk that it harms future reputation, and that might harm the self-authorship projects of current employees. That doesn't mean it's a bad idea, but it does mean that forward-looking reputation should probably be understood as a form of collective self-authorship. If my college decides tomorrow that it's going to start doing more of X, admitting more of this type of student, or providing more support or less support to for this type of problem, we are collectively engaging in a project that will affect all of us and that will affect other people. And that means that there are quite important conclusions to draw about the governance mechanisms that surround decisions that are likely to have reputational consequences, and about the people that surround the people who set reputational policy. Okay, I'm going to give myself 3 minutes to mention artificial intelligence. There are 3 questions that I've been wrestling with. I have a draft article, but it really isn't ready for anybody. One is AI the sort of thing that can have a reputation? No. Perhaps an AI instance is, but even then, I'm not convinced. Second, what's AI got to do with reputations? And third, what's it got to do with selfhood? And here's a teaser on the last 2 questions. AI does a lot of heavy cognitive lifting for us. That means it has the capacity to determine, or at least significantly to affect, what parts of a vapor trail we attend to. And it can ensure that a vapor trail never evaporates. Something you put on social media today will still be there in 30 years' time. And if AI determines what we pay attention to, it affects the way that reputations are formed, and that means it almost certainly affects the way that we act. And if you take those arguments seriously, that means that AI is changing what we are in quite profound ways. And that means that the people who design AI systems and the people who regulate them aren't just dealing with not simple but easily defined problems about harm or honesty. They're dealing with deep questions about what we are and how we are in the world. Okay, I'm nearly done. This has been quite a long lecture for all of us. When I'm teaching, I usually tend to wake people up every 2 or 3 minutes by asking one of them to talk to me, and I'm sorry that I couldn't do that for you today. I hope, however, that I've convinced you that reputation is more than just an asset. It also reflects and in turn determines what we are in a very deep sense. That means that the people who sit on boards, on reputation committees, and inside PR companies face really important ethical challenges. And those challenges are only going to get more gnarly as AI affects the ways in which reputations are formed. And I'll stop there. So we have a bit of time, 10 minutes for questions. Go ahead.
I thank you so much. This has been one of the best lectures we've had in the last week and a half.
Ooh, tell the dean.
I'm curious about your take on the power of not caring about your reputation. We live in a world now that's increasingly formed by people who just throw their reputation to the wind or build a reputation with their own different tools that creates. We have a Democratic who's our president right now in the United States whose reputation is in real life very complicated, but he creates his own by the minute, and there's so much, different levels of truth to it all, and he's made a real power of not caring about it.
Do you think he doesn't care about his reputation? I think there's more than one reputational audience at work, right? So there's a reputational audience full of lefty liberals. He hates them. He kind of cares about his reputation with them, but he'd kind of like it to be awful. And then there's a reputational audience of the people who are often referred to as his base. I think he really cares about them. And I think sometimes he's successfully directed their attention in ways that I think probably obscure some facts. And I think sometimes he successfully directs their attention in ways that further obscure the facts. But I would say that man is heavily engaged in reputation management. I think he has just decided, I want this reputation to be bad, I want to annoy these people, and I want this reputation to be good. I think we're constitutively the sorts of things that can't help but care about reputation. I think we're very social beasts. So I think you're right, he's engaged in a very complicated form of reputation management. And I mentioned very briefly reputation doom loops, which was a phrase I invented yesterday. But I think something like a reputational doom loop is causing polarization. I mean, I watch Gavin Newsom, and, I kind of find it funny to watch his social media posts and Trump's social media posts. But what they're doing is directing attention and creating reputations that are diametrically opposed. There's a group over here that Trump wants to hate him, and a group here wants to love him. Newsom has the exact opposite goal. And I think you join the reputational audience that likes Gavin Newsom, you become more and more polarized from the audience that likes Trump, and I think I think that's why we're polarized. Go ahead.
How long does it generally take for reputation to be built up, and then when there's a scandal or reputation is broken, no matter if it's the individual or the organization, is it better to, shut down the whole thing and try to rebuild another organization, another self, or would you try to heal that reputation and bring it back to the legal record?
It's a really interesting question. So there is actually literature on this, and when Rupert's book comes out, there'll be a chapter about it. Building up a reputation is slow because people have to start believing that you're this type of thing. So the way I come to get you to believe that I'm this type of thing is behaving like this type of thing and telling you I'm this type of thing, and it will take a while for you to start to believe that I'm this type of thing. So there's a literature in the law and economics literature that looks at this, and if you and I want to build a reputational relationship, we start by allowing each other to do very small things. I give you a little bit of trust, and over time I give you a bit more, and eventually we get to the point where reputation is sustainable. And it's founded on things like perceptions of character. So if I have a particular public persona, that might help you better to trust me. When you lose a reputation, it's gone really fast. Because it's very hard to shift reputations, because what I pay attention to is driven by the reputation, and how I feel about the world is driven by the reputation, and I'm hostile towards evidence that that is against the reputation. I think that actually explains quite a lot about politics in this country and the United States right now. And once I suddenly realized that everything was wrong, the whole cognitive structure that supports my perspective of you collapses, and reputations die really fast. So they go fast. You can rebuild them. Whether it's worth rebuilding them, I don't know. It's very hard. I mean, there's something in the rubble, right? It's conceivable that an organization might, people remember things about it. Stories about organizations have power. So it's conceivable they could be rebuilt. But I think that's a contextual thing. You said something about organizational selves. I didn't put the 10 slides in about whether they have them. I'm not sure that they do. If they do, they're very different than yourself and myself. Myself exists in my consciousness, and so does yours. If the side business school has a self, it exists in the consciousnesses of a whole load of people who observe it, and they have to coordinate in some way. So there's something complicated and fascinating about organizational selves. So there's a hand at the back. Go ahead.
I have a question about the seemingly heavier weight of bad actions on a reputation as compared to good. It seems like you start your reputation as a safe neutral, and then if you do good actions, that slowly builds up a good reputation. But if you have a singular bad action, it's almost like an aha moment. Now we know the true self, which is actually bad and has been bad all along. And so then it seems like the reputation may not
Right.
take into account the full true self of all the good because of that singular bad action. So how would you speak to
I think I roughly agree with you. Two things I'd slightly change the language. I might go to my way to get a reputation for being unstable. I'm pretty sure Donald Trump is not as unstable as, I was about to say, I'm pretty sure he's not as unstable as I think he is, but you get what he wants to portray a persona that is very, very aggressive. And many people might think that's not a good thing to have. So he keeps doing aggressive stuff. And we come to believe he's aggressive. I'm not sure I need the word good. I can build a reputation that's got all sorts of valences. And a reputation for being a hard-ass bully might be really useful to me. Although I think it's morally a bad reputation to want to have. If I believe you're a saint, then one failure is enough to convince me you're not a saint. But I probably don't think you're a saint. So there is an economic literature on this. What happens when you see a bad action very often is that you just become less sure of the person you're dealing with. So reputations can oscillate in some sense if you try to make them more, try to quantify them, as economists have tried to do. Go ahead.
So you were talking about how actors are interacting with one another, how they're building a network. That makes me think of Bruno Latour's actor network theory. I wonder if you have applied any of his principles to your research, how you think those would fit in, and whether you think that reputations could in fact be sort of their own actor within this network, or whether that's the relationality between actors.
I think it's the relationality between actors. I think this framework's useful, but I'm not an expert. What I've read about it suggests to me it works very nicely. But I don't think, I'm aware of how one would argue that reputation is an actor, but I don't think it is. I think reputation is a statement about how a person is in relationship to a network of people that surrounds them. So it's the lines rather than the nodes in those networks. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there research on the effect of authenticity regarding reputation? So, for example, you have consultancies and tech companies wanting to change the world for the better, and then let's say you have banks who are just clear, we want to make the best deal with the highest profit, and both have that reputation, and maybe both function the same way, but one is trying to paint this prettier picture. Is there research of what's more effective?
Yeah, there is, and you can read about it in Rupert's book. The word authenticity is quite charged, so I'm coming at this in a slightly more philosophical angle than Rupert. I think authenticity refers to being what you actually are, and therefore you have to establish what you actually are. So I, for example, am free to choose what I am. I've said that a lot. If I start behaving like I'm not free to choose what I am, I'm being inauthentic. So if I say I couldn't possibly do this because I have no choice, I'm already not being authentic. That's a bad way to live. What does it mean for an organization to be authentic? Well, organizations are things that can have, I can say things that are true of organizations. An organization behaving like what it isn't is a hard thing to define because you need to say what an organization is. So very often people use inauthentic to mean you say one thing and do another. I think that's lying. I don't think it's inauthenticity. But yeah, authenticity, the nature of selfhood for organizations is something I've been worrying about a lot lately. But I only had an hour today. Go ahead, yeah.
How would you delineate reputation from stereotype? Is it like a lot of the elements being very quickly going to stereotype and you
Actually, yeah.
behaves away?
I like that question. So I might say, if I said, this would be a meaningless sentence, if I said Ireland has a reputation for being full of red-headed people, Ireland doesn't have a reputation because Ireland is not an actor. So on my account, Ireland can't have a reputation. What I've just given you is a stereotype. So I think a stereotype is a blanket statement that people behave like it's true, but it's not really based on any assessment of vapor trail, and it's not necessarily even based upon actions. So that's the distinction I would draw. It's an interesting one. Stereotypes affect behavior. So if it is true that there are more red-headed people in Ireland than elsewhere, but it's still quite a small fraction of the population. It's like 7% instead of 4%. But when people think about the Irish, they think about people with red hair. And this has an effect on the way that they make decisions, even in financial markets. So if you take Pedro Bardalo's course, he'll talk about this. This has quite a profound effect on the way the world is. But I think that's something distinct from reputation. Go ahead. So your first question is about how organizational responsibility relates to individual responsibility, moral. And the second one was how collaboration...
Associative responsibility, associative reputation. So can I speed up someone else's reputation by collaborating with them?
Well, in reverse order, because they're easier the other way around, I think you can. And one reason that people work together is because they have complementary or different reputations. So if I worked with you, no one knew who I was, and everyone knew who you were, and everyone trusted you, and you had a reputation for probity, and you said, Morrison's okay, he'll do what I tell him to do, that would allow me to get things done I otherwise couldn't do, and that would enable me to perform forms of self-authorship that otherwise would be closed to me. So I think collaboration like that is important, and it's one reason that organizations sometimes get off the ground. The question about the distinction between corporate and individual moral agency is so difficult, I'm slightly going to park it, because if you want to claim an organization is morally responsible, you're making quite a big claim. It's obvious to me that I can blame you for things. If you take an action, then I can blame you. What does it mean to blame Oxfam for an action? And I think this is something I talk about in my Trinity Term Elective, which I will all take. If I blame Oxfam, that means I'm blaming something over and above the people in Oxfam. But Oxfam is just the people in Oxfam. So there's something about the way the institution works, the way it directs attention, the way it makes people behave, that generates responsibility at the organizational level. And I certainly think it's possible, and I think you can separate the reputation of individuals from the reputation of organizations, but not totally. In the case of Oxfam, incidentally, the chief executive came out 2 days after the scandal broke and said people were just taking it too seriously. So that didn't go well for him. The day after that, Desmond Tutu withdrew his support for Oxfam. But yeah, it's a very deep and difficult question, but I think the way to get at it is to start to understand exactly what moral responsibility means at the corporate level. Are we out of time? I'm not sure. I can do one more and then it's time to go. Go ahead, your question. I think,
Of what reputation should be, you fall into that. So I think maybe if you can help me.
well, I think you're right.
How you view that.
I think you're right. If you become excessively focused on reputation, you do start to be partly constructed by societal expectations. I defy anybody in this room to tell me how they were not partially constructed by the expectations of the society in which they grew up. So I think that's just a fact about human beings. I also think, as I think you're attempting to suggest, that virtuous character traits are things that we should all aim to accomplish. But very often character traits only make sense in social situations. So the word kindness only makes sense in a social, the word courage. What it means to be courageous if you're a member of the Special Forces is very different than what it means to be courageous if you're an intensive care doctor or an accountant dealing with the mob or a police person. And yet those things are all valuable character traits that make for human flourishing. It's just that to understand them, I need other people, and that means I'm probably going to fall back on other people's collective assessment of what I'm doing, and whether I like it or not, I'm in hock to reputation. I don't have to accept it, but I can't ignore it. I think I'm the sort of person who either accepts or rails against a reputation, but it's going to be a defining factor in the way that I experience the world. Okay, we're done.